The Sega Saturn matters, and these days, perhaps more than ever. While today's game industry is dominated by AAA live service bloat, fortunately we can still celebrate the mid-90s, a magical time. Released more than 30 years ago and widely considered a failure in the West, the Saturn represents everything missing from today's industry. Smaller budgets, complete experiences at launch, and developers are free to innovate without being shackled by shareholder expectations. So, bearing this in mind, a great console like this that most people skipped back in the day becomes the perfect alternative to today's homogenised gaming landscape. Instead of endless patches, predatory monetization schemes and a focus-tested design by committee, the Saturn offers a portal back to a time when games were bold, self-contained visions, strange, risky and yet gloriously unpolished. It's a machine that thrived on experimentation, 2D and 3D colliding in weird and wonderful ways, arcade sensibilities merging with home console ambition, and developers pushing unfamiliar hardware to its limits, purely for the thrill of creation. In revisiting the Sega Saturn now, we're not just dusting off an old console, we are reconnecting with a moment in gaming history when imagination took precedence over market research, and when every new release felt like a leap into the unknown. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly the kind of energy we all need more of in our lives again. I am Lady Arcade, and with this new channel I'm hoping to save you from the monotony of modern gaming. So if you're into a bit of the old retro gaming goodness, then please hit subscribe. And today we're going to be exploring the Sega Saturn, its history, and why it's still worth playing today. The Sega Saturn made its debut in Japan on the 22nd of November 1994, and the launch was nothing short of explosive. Forbes reported that all 200,000 units allocated for release sold out immediately, with 170,000 consoles snapped up on the very first day. This gave Sega an early lead over Sony, whose PlayStation would arrive just 2 weeks later. As the heart of this momentum was Virtua Fighter. Far more than just a launch title, it was a cultural event. Sega's official archive recalls how Virtua Fighter matches filled arcades throughout Japan, making it a cultural phenomenon, even earning recognition from the Smithsonian Institution as a landmark in technological achievement. Contemporary retrospectives regularly note that when the game was ported to the Saturn, demand was so high that hardware effectively sold on the strength of Virtua Fighter alone, which, while rather rudimentary looking today, but then it was a different story altogether. Yu Suzuki, its creator, later remarked that the game's appeal came from its realism. Players felt the characters had weight and presence, a sharp contrast with the cartoonish fighters of the era. The effect on the market was, of course, immediate. Sega's market share in Japan jumped from 12% in 1994 to 32% in 1995, while Nintendo's collapsed from 75% to 33%. This was the single largest market share swing in Japanese console history, and at its peak in 1995 and 1996, the Saturn was selling roughly 50% more units than the PlayStation during the first half of the year. Not a bad start at all for a console that many today say started as a failure. The momentum didn't fade quickly either. Records suggest that the Saturn ultimately managed to shift 5.75 million units in Japan, surpassing the earlier Mega Drive's 3.58 million and making it Sega's best-selling home console ever in its domestic market. To put that into perspective, the Saturn sold more in Japan alone than the Nintendo 64, GameCube or Wii U managed in the same territory. So for Sega, it was the rare moment where they not only challenged Nintendo but genuinely reshaped the balance of power back home. However, if the Saturn began its life in Japan with confidence, of course its arrival in North America would end up being the polar opposite. Infamously, at E3 1995, Sega stunned the industry by announcing the console would be made available immediately 4 months ahead of schedule, which, while perhaps sounding exciting to consumers, would quickly lead to all sorts of issues. By this point, legendary Sega of America CEO Tom Kalinske had argued for a proper September launch with a strong library. Kalinske wanted this for a very simple reason. He understood that Sega's entire reputation in the West hinged on this momentum. The Genesis had clawed its way to relevance through careful marketing, a focused release strategy, and a killer lineup that hit all at once, and he knew the Saturn needed the same kind of coordinated strike if it was to stand a chance against Sony's incoming PlayStation. To him, a September launch wasn't just about giving developers more time to finish their games, it was about ensuring the machine debuted with hype, retailer support, and enough software variety to capture the public's imagination. In essence, he wanted Sega to control the conversation, to enter the new 32-bit era looking confident, prepared, and powerful, not rushed, disorganised, and half-empty on shelves. Instead, Sega of Japan's surprise early launch pulled the rug from under him, leaving stores unprepared, third-party developers blindsided, and consumers staring at a sparse, expensive library. The very scenario that Kalinske had warned would kill the Saturn's chances before it even got started. The fallout was catastrophic. Retailers who hadn't been told in advance felt betrayed. Big brands such as Best Buy and Walmart were left out entirely, while Press Pause Radio noted that KB Toys, one of America's largest toy retailers, responded by boycotting Sega products altogether. Even stores that did get stock often received no more than a handful of units, leaving shelves empty and consumers baffled. To compound issues further, early software support was equally dire. The original plan called for 20 launch titles, but early adopters were given only 6 games, with no Sonic to bolster the brand. As writer Hugh Johnson later observed, early buyers were left with little more than Virtua Fighter and a long wait for anything else. In a now iconic moment, Sony capitalised perfectly. At the same E3 that the Saturn stealth launch would be announced, PlayStation executive Steve Race walked on stage, uttered a single phrase, $2.99, and walked off. The contrasting strategy could not have been starker. Sega had already burned through $50 million in marketing for a September launch that never came, while Sony's 3-digit announcement cost them nothing. The result was immediate and irreversible. Retailers lost faith, developers hesitated, and Sega's reputation, carefully built during the Genesis era, collapsed almost overnight. This surprise launch contributed towards hardware shortages, a software drought, and most importantly, a permanent loss of retailer confidence that haunted the Saturn for the rest of its life. But it wasn't all doom and gloom regarding the Saturn launching in regions beyond Japan. Across the pond, Europe briefly told a different story. In the UK, the Saturn actually outsold the PlayStation during its first Christmas season, riding on the strength of Virtua Fighter 2 and Sega's unmatched arcade pedigree. This wasn't a coincidence or some fluke of timing. Sega still carried enormous brand cachet here from the Mega Drive era. To many British gamers, Sega was video gaming, the name behind Sonic the Hedgehog, Streets of Rage, Golden Axe, and the blisteringly fast arcade conversations that had defined living rooms and school playgrounds in the early 90s. So when the Saturn landed with cutting-edge arcade experiences, it felt like a natural continuation of that legacy. The PlayStation, by contrast, was a total unknown. Sony had no gaming history, and to the average consumer, their grey box carried none of the warm familiarity that Sega did. The Sega logo reassured parents. Kids were dazzled by the instant, accessible thrills of recognisable arcade hits. In short, early adopters in Britain weren't necessarily buying into a new risky feature. They were doubling down on a brand that had defined their childhoods. For a fleeting moment, the Saturn wasn't seen as the underdog at all, but as the safe bet, the logical next step in the Sega story. Sony's deeper marketing budget and stronger third-party support quickly reversed the momentum, and by the end of 1996, PlayStation had overtaken the Saturn across Europe, setting the stage for Sega's decline outside of Japan. The Saturn's greatest strength was also its undoing, its architecture. Unlike the PlayStation's sleek, developer-friendly design, Sega's engineers created a machine that was breathtakingly powerful on paper, but bewilderingly complex in practice. It crammed 8 separate processors into its frame, 2 Hitachi SH2 CPUs running in parallel, a Motorola 68EC000 handling sound, a custom DSP inside the Saturn control unit for geometry, and a pair of video display processors VDP1 and VDP2 working together to render visuals. Rather than following a single cohesive design philosophy, it felt like several cutting-edge ideas from Sega's arcade division had been jammed together into a home console. This gave it astonishing capabilities when fully harnessed, particularly for 2D and sprite-based effects, but it also made development notoriously difficult. Studios had to carefully juggle workloads across multiple chips just to get stable performance, and few had the time, budget or documentation to do so. In the hands of Sega's own teams, the hardware could sing, but for everyone else, it often felt like trying to pilot a rocket with a car manual. What was true, though, was that when both of its video processors were harnessed together, the Saturn could push a far higher fill rate than the PlayStation, allowing it to excel at richly detailed 2D graphics. This advantage was immediately visible in games like Guardian Heroes, which stood out for its sharp sprites, smooth animation, and multi-layered backgrounds that other systems struggled to match. Fighting game publishers such as SNK and Capcom eagerly capitalized on this strength, releasing ports like X-Men vs Street Fighter that was regarded as virtually indistinguishable from their arcade counterparts when used with the Saturn's RAM expansion cartridges. These particular games looked great. However, sadly, most developers weren't familiar with parallel processing, so many games ended up using only one of the 2 CPUs, leaving much of the system's power untapped. The console had been designed primarily for 2D, with 3D capability added late in development, and the result was a machine powerful in theory but frustrating in practice. Yuji Naka, the creator of Nights into Dreams, once admitted that he wasn't convinced by pure 3D at first, saying that TV is a 2D medium and that a hybrid approach felt more natural, a philosophy reflected in Knight's combination of 3D environments and 2D gameplay paths. Even so, the Saturn was not the dead end it was once thought to be. Modern homebrew developers have proven that its architecture was far more capable than the 1990s tools allowed. Programmer Seven Shades, for example, recreated Peach's castle from Super Mario 64 on the Saturn, demonstrating that the hardware could indeed handle advanced 3D environments if given the right support. As he put it, "You can definitely start from zero, but it might take a lot of time." This is the paradox of the Saturn, a console that is both brilliant and broken. It offered unrivaled 2D performance that has stood the test of time, yet its potential in 3D went largely unrealised. The machine's complexity was its curse in the 1990s, but today, that same complexity has become a source of fascination for developers determined to uncover what it might have achieved had the industry been ready for it. In July 1996, Sega of America brought in Bernie Stolar, who had previously worked at Sony. His arrival marked an immediate and dramatic shift in the company, and not for the better. On his very first day, he oversaw the dismissal of more than 200 staff, one of the largest industry layoffs of the entire decade. His brief was blunt: slash costs, overhaul operations, and start paving the way for Sega's next console. The real damage came the following year. At E3 in 1997, Stolar publicly stated that the Saturn had no future, effectively signalling the end of the console while it was still on the market. This moment is often recounted as if Stolar simply walked on stage and casually announced the Saturn was dead, but the reality is a bit more nuanced and frequently taken out of context. By the time of E3 1997, the Saturn was already floundering in North America. Sales were collapsing, third-party support had evaporated, and internally, Sega had shifted most of its resources towards developing the successor that would become the Dreamcast. Stolar's comment wasn't an unprompted death sentence so much as an attempt to pivot the company's messaging towards the future, reassuring publishers and investors that Sega had a plan beyond its struggling hardware. In other words, the remark didn't kill the Saturn so much as acknowledge what was already happening behind the scenes. However, because it was said publicly while the console was still on store shelves, it was interpreted as if Sega officially abandoned the platform. And that perception more than the intent is what caused such lasting damage. The effect was catastrophic. Third-party publishers quickly withdrew their support, retailers reduced their shelf space, and even the system's most loyal fans felt betrayed by Sega's willingness to abandon its own platform so openly. Stolar's philosophy had been shaped by his time at Sony. He had long opposed bringing over Japanese RPGs and 2D titles, believing they wouldn't sell in the North American market. This was confirmed by Victor Ireland, president of Working Designs, who later recalled that Stolar flatly rejected localization pitches for major titles, insisting that RPGs are not a significant portion of the market. As a result, games like Ark the Lad and Grandia, hugely successful in Japan, never reached the Saturn in America. That year, Stolar also introduced the so-called 5-star games policy. It was supposed to be a quality control initiative, but in practice, it became the blunt instrument that blocked many Japanese-developed titles, especially the RPGs and 2D releases. Even projects that passed the test, such as a planned Saturn port of Diablo, were cancelled, not due to quality concerns, but because the Saturn hardware sales had collapsed under the weight of his own decisions. The long-term effects of Stolar's policies were deeply ironic. By blocking or limiting Western releases, he guaranteed that the Saturn's most ambitious games, Panzer, Dragoon, Saga, Magic Knight, Rayearth, and Shining Force 3, were printed in such low numbers that they are now among the most valuable and collectible titles in all of retro gaming. In trying to bury the Saturn, Stolar inadvertently ensured its rarest releases achieved legendary status. Titles everyone wants to add to their collections today. While the Saturn stumbled badly in the West, the picture in Japan was dramatically different. It wasn't just about the hardware sales, it was about engagement. Sega Retro notes that Saturn owners consistently bought more software than their PlayStation counterparts. This higher attach rate meant that the Saturn became the machine of choice for dedicated players, while Sony's console often attracted a more casual audience who purchased fewer games per system. One of the key turning points in the Saturn's success in Japan was the emergence of Sakura Wars. The original game in 1996 sold around 360,000 copies, and its 1998 sequel proved even more impactful, shifting over 500,000 units in its first week and eventually becoming one of the console's best-selling titles. The series rapidly expanded beyond games into anime, manga, novels, and even stage productions, turning the Saturn into a centerpiece of a full-scale multimedia phenomenon, a model of cross-media synergy that would go on to become commonplace in Japanese entertainment. Marketing reinforced this cultural presence. Sega's ad campaign introduced Sagata Sanshiro, a stern martial arts figure who punished people for not playing the Saturn. His commercials became instantly iconic, culminating in a storyline where he sacrificed himself to save Sega headquarters. Even today, Sagata Sanshiro is remembered as one of gaming's most beloved advertising mascots. Yet, for Western audiences, much of this success went largely unseen. Over 80% of the Saturn's library never made it out of Japan, with hundreds of RPGs, strategy games, and 2D fighters remaining exclusive to its domestic market. Decisions such as Bernie Stolar's push against releasing RPGs in America only deepened this divide. As a result, Western players never encountered the same rich variety of software that had made the Saturn so popular in Japan, creating a stark gap between the system's reputation at home and its far weaker legacy abroad. All the more reason, though, to explore its library today. Despite its reputation in the West as a struggling system, the Saturn's library contained a selection of titles that not only defined the console but also stand the test of time today. These weren't half-finished experiments or live service placeholders, they were fully realised experiences that still hold up 3 decades later. Virtua Fighter 2 became the Saturn's definitive system seller and the game most closely tied to its identity. Running at 60 frames per second with sharp high-resolution visuals, it was a remarkable technical achievement achievement that came astonishingly close to matching its arcade counterpart. Its deep mechanics made it one of the first 3D fighters to be taken seriously at a competitive level, laying the groundwork for modern fighting games. For Japanese players in particular, it cemented the Saturn as the home of serious arcade-style experiences, while in the West, it demonstrated that Sega's hardware could truly deliver when backed by its strongest IP. Bundling Virtua Fighter 2 with the hardware in Japan turned the game into a cultural touchstone, driving a surge in console sales and anchoring the Saturn's success in its home market. For many players, it wasn't just another launch title, it was the reason to own the system at all. But if Virtua Fighter represented technical mastery, then Guardian Heroes represented the Saturn's creative range. Developed by the ever-ambitious minds at Treasure, Guardian Heroes stood as a dazzling reminder that the Saturn was capable of so much more than straightforward arcade ports. On the surface, it resembled a traditional side-scrolling brawler, but once the action began, it quickly revealed its depth. Players could leap between multiple planes of action, commanding chaotic, large-scale battles as dozens of characters filled the screen at once. Beneath the flurry of swords and sorcery, it wove in branching story paths and multiple endings, giving players a sense of agency and narrative weight rarely seen in the genre at the time. What truly made it remarkable, though, was how it blurred the line between brawler and role-playing game. Characters could level up between stages, distributing stat points to shape their playstyle, while persistent experience systems rewarded commitment and experimentation. This gave each run a personal sense of growth and progression, a feeling that you weren't just replaying a linear beat-em-up, but forging your own legend within its chaotic, enchanting world. For players accustomed to the short burst thrills of arcade titles, this depth was revelatory. Even today, Guardian Heroes stands out as one of the most distinctive and ambitious games of its era, a riot of colour, creativity and controlled mayhem that still feels fresh decades later. It showed that the Saturn could be more than a conduit for Sega's coin-op heritage. It could nurture completely original experiences designed for the home, where arcade time constraints didn't limit imagination. In doing so, Treasure didn't just craft a cult classic, they helped prove the Saturn was capable of hosting games every bit as inventive and daring as anything on rival systems. But for some people, this is their favourite Saturn game. Of all of the treasures in the Saturn's library, Panzer Dragoon Saga is often regarded as its crowning achievement, a swan song that arrived in 1998 just as the world was already turning to the next generation. Released in heartbreakingly small numbers, with only around 30,000 copies distributed in North America, it quietly slipped into obscurity at launch before gradually becoming a legend. Yet its reputation isn't built on scarcity alone. From its opening moments, it radiated a cinematic ambition and emotional depth that felt utterly unlike anything else on the system. What set it apart was how boldly it reimagined what an RPG could be, rather than following the genre's familiar template of static battles and rigid menus. It fused the series' signature rail shooter mechanics with a fluid, semi-real-time combat system built around movement and positioning. Players soared through ruined landscapes on the back of a dragon, weaving between enemy fire as they planned their attacks, all while exploring a crumbling empire steeped in melancholy and mystery. It was as much about atmosphere and emotion as it was about mechanics, with its haunting world and mournful tone lingering long after the credits rolled. Even without its notorious rarity, Panzer Dragoon Saga would still stand as one of the Saturn's defining works, a testament to what Sega's hardware could achieve when paired with pure creative vision. It embodied the kind of bold, uncompromising artistry that the Saturn made possible at its best, a deeply personal, intricately crafted adventure that felt less like a product and more like a final defiant statement from a console determined to go out on its own terms. No exploration of the Saturn would be complete without Nights into Dreams, Sega's bold attempt to craft a new mascot franchise to stand alongside Sonic the Hedgehog. Created by Yuji Naka and the team behind Sonic's original success, it was a striking departure from their earlier work, not a platformer but a dreamlike flight game that defied easy categorization. Players guided the ethereal Knights through dazzling dreamscapes, looping and diving through the air with balletic grace, chasing high scores through precision and momentum rather than conventional platforming challenges. It was elegant, hypnotic, and unlike anything else on the market. Technically, it was a marvel. The game wove together 2D and 3D design in a way that reflected Naka's belief in the strengths of side-on presentation, while still embracing the possibilities of full 3D space. The flowing level design encouraged perfect lines and rhythmic movement, rewarding mastery with a sense of effortless speed and freedom. Its visual style was equally striking, filling the screen with surreal colours and dreamlike architecture that perfectly captured the sense of drifting through a child's imagination. Even its controller made history. Nights into Dreams launched alongside a new analog gamepad designed specifically for its fluid aerial movement, a device that reached store shelves mere weeks before the Nintendo 64's joystick debuted. This innovation helped cement the game as one of the most forward-thinking titles of its era, a vivid showcase of Sega's willingness to experiment with both form and technology. More than just a game, it became a statement of intent, proof that the Saturn could produce not just arcade hits, but entirely new kinds of experiences. The game was a blast to play, but not as much as this one. On the multiplayer front, Saturn Bomberman delivered what is still considered the definitive entry in Hudson Soft's long-running series. Whilst most players knew Bomberman from the NES or the SNES, the Saturn version took things to another level with support for up to 10 simultaneous players via multitaps. The result was chaotic, joyful gameplay that became a local multiplayer staple. It even won Multiplayer Game of the Year honours over Nintendo's GoldenEye 007, a remarkable achievement considering GoldenEye's cultural footprint. To this day, Saturn Bomberman is remembered not just as the best version of the series, but as one of the console's purest expressions of fun. Dragon Force was another title that offered something unique. In this strategy RPG, unlike the turn-based tactics of Fire Emblem or Shining Force, Dragon Force lets players marshal armies of up to 100 units in real-time battles across sprawling maps. The effect was unlike anything else on consoles at the time. Decades later, Saturn enthusiasts on Reddit still call it the pinnacle of the Saturn's offerings, praising its ambitious blend of grand strategy and RPG storytelling. While it flew under the radar during the system's life, it has since been re-evaluated as one of Sega's most innovative contributions to the genre. And then there were, of course, the 2D fighting ports, an area where the Saturn quietly outperformed the PlayStation in every metric. Thanks to its RAM expansion cartridges, Capcom and SNK titles such as X-Men vs Street Fighter, Marvel vs Street Fighter and King of Fighters 97 were delivered in near-arcade perfect form. These games became staples for hardcore players, and to this very day they stand as proof of how the Saturn's design, while awkward for 3D, gave it a decisive edge in 2D. Together, these games illustrate why the Saturn is far more than just a curiosity of the 1990s. The Saturn's library was built around fast-paced arcade-style gameplay and the distinctive creative energy that defined Sega at its peak. Beyond their flair and spectacle, these games reflected a philosophy of completeness, releases that arrived fully formed, carefully polished, and ready to enjoy from start to finish without years of patches, updates, or downloadable content. In today's industry, where unfinished launches have become increasingly common, the Saturn stands as a refreshing reminder of a time when games were crafted as complete experiences and a glimpse of what they could be again. While that's all very well and good for many players today, the greatest challenge with the Sega Saturn isn't finding games worth playing, it's affording them. Scarcity has turned the system into one of the most expensive collecting pursuits in retro gaming. Racket Boy lists Panzer Dragoon Saga as the ultimate prize, with complete North American copies ranging anywhere from $550 to $2,150, and sealed examples fetching even higher. Its combination of critical acclaim and tiny print run has made it the single most sought-after Saturn title. Other titles have also climbed sharply in value over the years. Cult favourites like Magic Knight Rayearth now often sell for around $1,000, while sought-after releases such as The House of the Dead can reach close to $900. Even long-time multiplayer staples like Saturn Bomberman have risen to a few $100s, prices that would have seemed unimaginable just a decade ago. Thankfully, these days offer alternatives that early generations of Saturn fans could only dream of. The Satiator is one such solution. Designed by Professor Abrasive, this $259.99 optical drive emulator, as the creator explained, utilises the video CD card slot on the back of the console. Often celebrated for its ease of use, this solution is now rich with features and a relatively high compatibility rate. Crucially, unlike other ODEs, it's non-destructive, preserving the console's original hardware while expanding its capabilities. Another option is the Pseudo Saturn Kai, a software exploit detailed by PP Center. It allows players to boot backups from CDRs using nothing more than a cartridge. The latest update, version 6.541, even adds cheat support and broad compatibility with all major ODEs, making it a versatile and inexpensive way to expand access to the library. The community has also developed tools that breathe new life into the platform. One notable example is the Saturn Ring Library, a modern SDK created to make homebrew development more accessible. Its arrival has already encouraged a wave of new projects, from ports of PlayStation classics to entirely original visual novels, showing that even 3 decades later the Saturn continues to inspire experimentation and creativity. Equally important is the work of the fan translation scene, with over 80% of the Saturn's library never leaving Japan. Translation groups are steadily opening its vast back catalogue to international audiences for the first time. Classics like Sakura Wars, Grandia and Shin Megami Tensei Devil Summoner, once logged to Japanese text, are now fully playable in English, effectively expanding the Western library far beyond what was available during its original lifespan. And beyond hardware mods, the Saturn is more playable today than ever through accurate emulation projects such as MedNathan and FPGA-based solutions like Mister, both praised for their fidelity. Even commercial products like the Polymega market themselves on Saturn compatibility, demonstrating how central the system has become to the modern retro ecosystem. What was once a prohibitively expensive system is now, thanks to these solutions, more accessible than ever. While collectors chase 4-figure rarities, modern players can explore the Saturn's history through affordable practical methods that keep its legacy alive. The Saturn's reputation in the West may have been tarnished in the 1990s, but in recent years the system has enjoyed a noticeable resurgence. Collectors, preservationists and new players alike are turning their attention back to Sega's misunderstood console, driven by a mix of nostalgia and critical reassessment. Several factors behind the wider retro gaming revival apply perfectly to the Saturn. The urge to revisit vintage games with their simpler, pixelized aesthetics, the tactile satisfaction of using original hardware, and the curiosity of younger players eager to explore the medium's history. In an era where many modern titles demand hundreds of hours and often launch unfinished, the Saturn's concise, self-contained, arcade-like experiences offer a refreshing alternative. Grassroots campaigns have also shaped this re-evaluation. The fan community at Sega Saturn Shiro launched the #ChangeTheNarrative initiative, urging players and journalists to see the console not as a commercial failure, but as a system that delivered some of the most ambitious and rewarding games of its generation. Their argument is simple: history should not be defined solely by sales figures, especially when the hardware's legacy continues to inspire new development and fan translations 3 decades later. Modern reassessments reinforce this shift. Publications and community analyses consistently highlight the Saturn as a 2D powerhouse ahead of its time. Its hardware was optimised for sprite handling and background layers in ways that even today's emulation struggles to replicate perfectly. Titles such as Radiant Silvergun, Guardian Heroes and X-Men vs Street Fighter showcase technical feats that remain impressive, and critics now frame them as precursors to the modern indie renaissance that embraces pixel art, tight combat systems and concise design. Taken together, nostalgia, rediscovery and critical re-evaluation have reshaped the Saturn's reputation. What was once a shorthand for corporate mismanagement is now being recognised as one of the most fascinating, forward-thinking consoles of its era, a machine that feels strangely aligned with what many players are seeking from games in 2025. Basically, this Saturn's legacy may be complicated, but it has never been more relevant. Where today's AAA market is dominated by sprawling budgets, unfinished live service experiments, and corporate risk aversion, Sega's mid-90s console embodied the opposite philosophy. Its games were complete from day one, its developers prioritised innovation over scale, and its experiments in both 2D and 3D design still resonate with players weary of today's excesses. The contrast with the modern industry could not be clearer. Bloomberg reported that Sony had cancelled 8 of its 12 planned live service projects, while analysts continue to warn of escalating costs that threaten to push game budgets beyond sustainability. Against this backdrop, the Saturn stands as proof that unforgettable experiences don't require a billion-dollar investment, only creative vision and the freedom to pursue it. For decades, the Saturn was dismissed as a misstep, a cautionary tale of corporate mismanagement, but today its reputation has shifted. It is now seen as a system that's captured a creative peak in console design, offering originality, variety, and craftsmanship at a time when those qualities feel increasingly rare. So perhaps the real question is no longer whether the Saturn was worth owning in the 1990s. The real question is this: today, can you afford to miss out on gaming history's most misunderstood masterpiece? Let me know in the comment section. By the way, I know every creator on this platform says this, but here it genuinely matters. If you're watching this and enjoyed it, taking a moment to engage makes an enormous difference. This is a brand new channel, and right now the algorithm doesn't even know it exists. Every like, every comment, and especially every subscribe tells it, hey, this is worth showing to more people. When a channel is just starting, it's like shouting into the void. Even if the content is good, it can disappear without a trace unless people actively help to give it that first spark of momentum. And that spark, that tiny push from you, is often the difference between a video reaching a handful of viewers or thousands. It really does mean the world to me. It's a new decade for Lady Arcade. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all again soon.